Kula mahlata mnyama, kula mahlata mnyama, sekugcwela buthebula, amabhunu abasayingeni ngoba ekebuyayo. Awusebekhulume Pitoli, masebekhulume Pitoli, sebekhulume Bloemfontein, sebekhulume Mgungundlovu ngoba ekebuyayo. Ashe angolayo amnyam kuzodliwa inkomo, angolayo mama, angolayo kwitokwa navale, angolayo bare Fidel Castro, angolayo tumela machuni, angolayo mama, angolayo kwitokwa navale, angolayo. Amandla tension. Good evening, comrades. As we are waiting for other comrades to come online, let's agree on an important principle that keep half and pass it, but how we are going to approach this discussion is that we want you to agree with me that we will not take the Q&A session on screen, because ke bone e ka bata comrade da ding ba tsa dipare man o no ntse bala mo di comments o di analyze o sa tlhaloganya, and then from there one sara, and people fizzle out, data ya senyega. So what we are going to do is that we are going to take a Q&A session off screen, so you can text your comments, then we discuss at length outside this screened platform, but on Facebook, both on Ngaka Modiri Molema and of course on my page, comrades. So that's how we are going to fashion this discussion. But keep half and pass, and then from there would have done. So we'll dedicate exactly an hour after the discussion, which hour would be for the Q&A after this discussion. I'm emphasizing that it's a discussion, Matabani. It's not a lecture. So I don't possess all the answers, and perhaps the answers can even come out more out of our discussion in the Q&A session. But let's get into the meat of issues, comrades. And perhaps just to craft a semblance of topical discipline, we will have to say that we are going to approach this discussion in the following fashion. The first thing we are going to do, comrades, is that we are going to do some kind of humble introduction so that you understand the angle from which we are coming in discussing the balance of forces. Secondly, comrades, we are going to, as a matter of necessity, kind of definitional account of key concepts which we think you must plug at the back of your mind as you are navigating with us into the discussion about the international balance of forces. Then, comrades, from there, we think we can then safely graduate into a discussion about the evolution of the balance of forces. We will not start too far in history, we'll just start here in 1815 hitherto. After that, comrades, we will then get into a discussion having looked at the evolution of the balance of forces through the concept of polarity. We'll get into a discussion now about characterizing the balance of forces today, and then make a few final comments about what it means for us as Africans. So let's get into the meat of issues. Firstly, comrades, in our introduction, we want to begin by saying that we are Marxist-Leninist in orientation. We are Marxist-Leninist with an Africanist orientation. And therefore, that's the school of thought and the orientation from which we will move as we navigate through the topic. It's important to emphasize that so that you're not surprised when certain elements of our school of thought come into the discussion. Having said that, comrades, we may not be narrow Africologists by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's important to perhaps capture the mood of this discussion by acknowledging a very profound thing that the great Sanusi, with his limitations because he was human, Vusama Zulu, Credo Mutwa, peace be upon his name, and may his soul rest in peace, says and teaches us that, the life of a Sangoma is a very interesting but lonely pilgrim in which you have to navigate between the known and the unknown as you shuttle through a grey, lonely road where you have to toss between the visible and the invisible. Now, such a revolutionary ideologue, Macabane, when Fidel Castro sat in Mexico with his commissars, which would have included Bo Raul Castro, Bo Che Guevara, to decide when to enter Cuba through that boat that they were given, donated to him by a friend of his, a wealthy businessman in Mexico. At the heart of the discussion, they were having a month on the eve of that expedition, or the discussion on the balance of forces. And that discussion had to look at the strength of the 26th July movement vis-a-vis the strength of the Batista regime against the international balance of forces and the local balance of forces. In the realm of the international balance of forces, there's no doubt about it that he would have had to look at the current, or rather the existing polarity of the world at that time. It's very clear that at that time, there were three superpowers. There was the US, the Soviet Union, and of course, Great Britain. US, Soviet Union, and Great Britain. Great Britain had undergone two difficult wars. Obviously, it was not going to be interested in what happens in Cuba because they were looking at their affairs internally. But the US was still excited, having emerged as a superpower at that time, wanting to expand its enclave. And similarly with the Soviet Union. And therefore, Cuba, what happened in Cuba would have been a matter of their interest. The US would have supported Batista, and the Soviet Union would have supported Castro. Now, Castro had to arrive at the conclusion that obviously there was a superpower equilibrium in that was to happen, the Soviet Union would come on his side. So he knew that at least he was covered in terms of the international balance of forces. So the battle would have been won on the local balance of forces. And if you had to look at issues of advantages and disadvantages, the objective and the subjective conditions on the ground, clearly Fidel Castro would have had to look at the fact that on his side, as an advantage, is that he was pursuing a guerrilla warfare, a people's war against a conventional army. Yes, which had more advanced ammunition than his, supported by the US at that time. But his advantage was that Batista was a dictator, and at that time, the cloud of hatred against him was growing amongst the peasantry in the way he was running the economy, and most importantly, the politics of the country, being the dictator that he was. And for that, Fidel Castro saw an opening, which, in terms of balance of forces, worked in his favor, because the peasantry and the working class were an important motive force in determining the revolution in Cuba. But most importantly, the fact that as he entered Cuba, as you would have seen through the Sierra Maestra, he was able to build alliances with the peasantry, the local peasantry, which some of whom were with the 26th of July movement as they marched along, which ultimately, if you look at the sum total of the balance of forces, came together to give Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement an advantage over the Batista regime, which ensured that in 1959 they were able to enter Havana victorious. Let's take this example of explaining the balance of forces maybe clearly back home and leave Cuba a bit. Let's enter it from a perspective of a case that is closer home, Wanki. I want to talk about Sipolilo, comrades, because Sipolilo, in my view, we can argue about it, was more of a distraction from the main expedition, which was Wanki. And remember that Wanki had two main objectives, which was firstly to navigate a Ho Chi Minh Trail. And a Ho Chi Minh Trail, comrades, is creating a path where you can create bases in a country so that you can deploy future infiltrations. That was the first objective. And the second one was to pierce a hole, which was a path into South Africa so that we can prepare for the People's War in South Africa. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as it were, would have to be in the then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And Oliver Tambo, when he said in 1967, obviously with the Political Military Council of the African National Congress in Mkhonto Esizwe at the time, would have had to consider a lot of things in the balance of forces. Firstly, as a negative, would have been the fact that there was no classical guerrilla terrain. Secondly, there was no peasantry along the countryside, as it was the case in Cuba, because the concept of crafting the guerrilla warfare amongst the people. There was no classical setting, such as was the case in Cuba and many other cases, which made it easier if you were entering a country such as South Africa through Rhodesia. And the other disadvantage was that they were fighting a conventional army in South Africa, which should have been reinforced by a cordon sanitaire of white minority regimes in Rhodesia itself, currently known as Zimbabwe, Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, and the Angolan, rather the Portuguese colonies in Angola and Mozambique. So, in considering the balance of forces, from a negative perspective, things that weighed against the decision to enter 1967 would have been those elements, which clearly tells you about the strength of the enemy gauged against ours. But on a positive note, which were things in the balance of force analysis which would have spelled in our favor to enter that expedition, would have been the fact that at the level of strength, we had the numbers. The people were on our side. There was a wave in the African continent of Africans in their different countries, including South Africa, calling for the decolonization of the continent, and in particular in South Africa, calling for the dismantling of apartheid capitalism. And that was a fundamental and moral high ground in entering this battle, which would have meant that in the theater in which we would be fighting this battle, there would have been an advantage of political and moral high ground, and that the people would have been easily turned against the apartheid regime. And that in these borderline states where there were white minority regimes, the majority were Africans who were supporting our struggle. So that's an important element in understanding the comparison that Oliver Tambo had in Lusaka, analyzing the balance of forces, against which he then took a decision, of course not alone, but him being the commander-in-chief of Mkhonto Esizwe, took a decision that we are deploying an elite detachment, which, as all of you would know, was named the detachment, because Chief Lituli had just passed on. And Oliver Oliver Tambo came to the conclusion that, because the ANC was very Sankaran, he believed that, a Sankara would say, a soldier without political consciousness is a potential criminal. That before this elite detachment, goes into Zimbabwe, or then known as Rhodesia, we would have to spend a lot of time politicizing it. As Chrisani explained, they went in highly politicized, understanding the mission with clear political conviction. And that would have been an important element in the considerations of entering the country, because our soldiers had the advantage of being more politically conscious about than the other side. But let's enter into Wanki more, comrades, and remember what happened. You would remember that, comrades, if you read your history properly, as Chrisani explains, they had 2 skirmishes in which they fought with the Rhodesia and South African forces vis-a-vis our side of things, where Umkhonto Wesizwe was in alliance with Zebra forces. And that was an example, or rather that is an example of who you are. We aligned with the Zebra forces, comrades, as you would know, their country. And they knew the terrain more than we did, as those who were belonging and were part of the elite Lutuli detachment. So this is the balance of forces question. Advantage in terms of understanding terrain. So Chrisani argues that they'd never lost any battle on the ground. They won the first 2 skirmishes after they entered the Zambezi. The first skirmish that they went into, which was more on the defensive, when the enemy attacked, they were able to defeat them. The second skirmish was them attacking an enemy base. And so therefore, they're vindicated. They won the battles on the ground. But of course, as you are fighting a battle such as Wanki, one of the things Chrisani explains is that they could not shoot the animals in the game reserve, because they would have alerted the enemy in terms of their movement. So one of the difficulties and the setbacks that they suffered in the Wanki expedition was that they ran out of food. They ran out of water. They ran even out of ammunition. They had to obviously retreat to Botswana. Now, in retreating to Botswana, Makabane, there was obviously a challenge there. Chrisani had to sit with the commander of the Lutuli detachment to discuss whether they must enter Botswana or not. And they had to have a very complex discussion around the balance of forces in terms of that principle of who to align with. And Chrisani remembers saying to the commander that, as the commissar, that it is safe to enter Botswana because Botswana is a member of the OAU. Botswana being a member of the OAU, on paper and theoretically, they would support our liberation struggle. Remember, Botswana had just gotten its independence in 66. This was 67 now. And we had Seretse Khama at the helm of Botswana, being the new president. So Chrisani says, no, these are members of the OAU. They will theoretically, obviously, support the liberation struggle. Let's go. And when we enter their community, what are we going to do? Are we going to fight the Botswana forces if they capture us? We have defeated South Africa and Rhodesia, but these ones, we can't defeat them, obviously, in their view. Fight when we get there, because we want political asylum from them. They entered Botswana, comrades, and in entering Botswana, obviously, things did not pan out the way they expected. One of the things that clearly happened was that they were arrested, arms taken away from them, incarcerated, and obviously treated badly, harassed, and all of those things that happened during that expedition. And history teaches us that what, from an analysis point of view, in terms of who to align with, Chrisani could have probably taken a wrong decision and misadvised the column that he had entered Botswana with in the elite Lutuli detachment. On the 5th of September that year, history teaches us that Seretse Khama writes a letter to KK, President Kenneth Kaunda, from president to president, and says to him, I've just captured 16 guerrillas. And amongst these 16 guerrillas, I can see that, which brings the total amount to about 33. But I'm worried, as president of Botswana, writing to you as president of Zambia, that you are actually in cahoots with these gangs. I'm paraphrasing him, comrades. I'm not quoting him verbatim. But one of the things that is key that Seretse raises in this letter to Kenneth Kaunda is that he says to Kenneth Kaunda, but what I don't understand is whether these guys gauged their strength against the joint South Africa and Rhodesian armies. I think they stood no chance. I, as Seretse Khama, realized that they would have been killed. I've arrested them. I'll be sending them back to you. But I doubt that they would have stood a chance against South Africa, as it were. Now, comrades, you can hear that in this tone of Seretse Khama, a question of the balance of forces was being raised. Whether Oliver Tambo, who was obviously speaking to KK, had gauged his forces against the joint South African Rhodesia forces correctly. But of course, Kriksani would have replied and said, no, we indeed have gauged our forces correctly. What Seretse has is an account of only about 33 soldiers that he has captured in Botswana. He does not know that actually this is just one column of the elite Lutuli detachment. And obviously, as we speak in Lusaka, Oliver Tambo is also preparing for another offensive which is coming to create a distraction away from the main offensive, which was Wangi. So that it becomes that is able to assist Wangi to succeed in achieving his mission. So that raises another important balance of forces question. We can go on and on, comrades. What we are doing in talking about Cuba and Wangi is just to illustrate the importance of reading the balance of forces correctly. Having done that, Makabane, let's now take this discussion further now into the evolution of the balance of forces and understand that as students of historical materialism, we can't talk about where we are not understanding where we come from. Let me start, as I said, in 1815 and say that from 1815, and I'm saying roughly, from 1815 until 1950, there was one superpower. And this superpower was Great Britain. Great Britain was strong in terms of these four ingredients of global hegemony: economic hegemony, political hegemony, and obviously military hegemony. And if you want examples to explain that, we know that that's how hitherto the pound is the strongest in the world, because of those many years of economic hegemony. Cultural hegemony, today the world's lingua franca is English. It's the legacy of British hegemony since 1815. We can go on and on to explain that Britain, during its reign as a sole superpower, comrades, was controlling 25% of the world's population. It was controlling 25% of the world's land area. That is why it was referred to as the empire in which the sun never sets. Noting the fact that in terms of its expansion, at any given time, the sun was lit in one of its territories. Such is the hegemony of Great Britain from 1815 to 1950, which it enjoyed as a sole superpower. Nobody, beginning to, dislocate it. But what is important, comrades, is to understand that Great Britain was a superpower at that time, a hegemon on its own, enjoying that superiority in terms of those four elements. But Great Britain went into two critical wars, the First World War and the Second World War. the First World War and the Second World War hurt the economy of Britain vehemently. And what is important, comrades, is that it was hurting Great Britain vehemently to a point where the economic hegemony was beginning to dwindle. And then two superpowers emerged, which was the Soviet Union and the US, Makaban. And obviously, as the Soviet Union and the US emerged, it was clear that from 1950, Great Britain was dwindling as a superpower. Now, what would have transpired in that situation was that to the extent that the Soviet Union and the US wanted to outwit Great Britain as a superpower, they agreed tactically to form an alliance until they eventually brought Great Britain as a superpower. This is during the Tripolar War, which lasted from about 1950 to 1980, and I'll explain why. But there was that primary contradiction between these two new superpowers and Great Britain, in that they knew that once they've outwitted Britain, one of them would have to take over, and they were beginning to fight amongst themselves. The greatest example of the theater of their conflict, which is the Soviet Union and the US, can be seen, for instance, comrades, in an example such as Vietnam. Have you ever asked yourself, comrades, a strategic question? Why the US would have tactically taken the side of France in trying to reverse the gains of the Vietnamese independence movement that was led by Ho Chi Minh? Have you ever asked yourself that question, comrades? The answer is simple but not simplistic. In 1950, Mao Zedong of Communist China took a decision that he is going to recognize Vietnam as an independent state, right? And the Soviet Union, which was led by Stalin, I think at the time, yes, it was Stalin, followed suit. And obviously, when Stalin died in March 1953, those that took over after him, took cue from him, which included, of course, Georgy Melenkov, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time. And realized that Southeast Asia was becoming a communist enclave. And based on that, tactically and ideologically, made a move to support France, to reverse the gains and continue with the suppression of the Ho Chi Minh movement, which wanted to see Vietnam as an independent state. When we have time, comrades, one day we'll return to this question of how Ho Chi Minh treated the Americans to help him push out the French. And that when his countrymen were celebrating, Ho Chi Minh says to his countrymen, I can see that you're celebrating that the French are leaving. But it's very clear that you can't see that the Americans are coming. Because he knew, Makabanika Oliver Tambo, that America was going to be a problem, being a superpower, entering Vietnam. But let's step off that, comrades. It was just by way of, explaining that Vietnam is a good example of the tensions that penned themselves out between the Soviet Union and the US during the tripolar system. Let's leave the period of tripolarity, which was 1950 to 1980, where these three superpowers dominated, and say that then things evolved. Clearly, Great Britain, having been hurt, the Soviet Union and the US roughly in 1980 emerged as the two superpowers and took over a contest of who controls the globe in terms of those four ingredients of power: political, economic, cultural, and military hegemony. And of course, they were the two most powerful, unwitted by anybody else, contesting against each other. On the left, the Soviet Union was trying to expand the world towards the communist bloc based on the Marxist doctrine. On the right, the US was trying to expand their bloc towards capitalism based on the liberal doctrine. And they're contesting for the world in that regard. And all of us know, because at least this is recent in history, what was taking place. And one of the tactical challenges that the Soviet Union faced as it navigated through that period where it was, in equilibrium power-wise with the US, was that it spent a lot of money and resources on the liberation struggles across the world, because it wanted to disrupt the status quo. Remember, having adopted a liberal world that was historically dominated by Britain, the US was easily in sync with the powers and the regimes that were in place at that time. So the disruption project of the Soviet Union, of those regimes to set up new regimes that were progressive and left, was very expensive for the Soviet Union. And towards the late 80s, it was very clear that the Russians internally were beginning to complain that their leadership was spending too much money in battles that the Russians were not benefiting from. So in 1989, when Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, rather Russia in particular, he decided that he's going to come up with a policy of perestroika and glasnost openness, which was inward looking, releasing the Soviet territories into some kind of self-determination pattern. Of course, there were internal pressures, comrade. It was not just out of the goodwill of Gorbachev. You remember in Yugoslavia, there was Marshal Tito, who was amongst the first to say, no, we are going, we want to leave this Soviet bloc for reasons that when we have time we can explain. But the point is, those push and pull pressures forced Gorbachev to come up with this policy. Of course, if it was Stalin, he would have looked at things differently and crushed, these insurrections. But Gorbachev decided that he's going to withdraw and allow, self-determination in the Soviet bloc. And as it were, we know perestroika, glasnost openness, allowed the Russians to breathe. But in terms of its implications in the international balance of forces, Makaban, is that it meant that the US now was emerging as a sole superpower in 1990. So roughly from 1919, I'm arguing until 2018, the US in Tsipusa fela ili superpower ili one. Because it emerged as superpower in terms of economic control, hegemony, political hegemony, cultural hegemony, and military hegemony. If you remember, in terms of cultural hegemony, Makaban, during that period, we were just eating. It was because of the economy. They pumped a lot of resources into, if you like, Hollywood. We're watching Santa Barbara. We're watching all these American movies which were teaching us about how the Americans are good and the Russians are bad. If we watch the movies, it's Rambo, Sylvester Stallone. That was cultural hegemony of the US at play. We can take it to the economic. The US had the biggest GDP. The US had the biggest army militarily. So they had hegemony. So they had the four pillars intact. That is why they've enjoyed hegemony from 1990 hitherto, which led the likes of Francis Fukuyama to come to the conclusion that what we have in the current international balance of forces is a reflection of the end of history, which meant that liberalism and capitalism had won, and that all development paths would take a capitalist path, and that history would never see anything else. But Fukuyama was wrong. If you look at his writings in the recent, he admits that he was wrong. So American hegemony, as it were, comrades, and I'm contending and arguing very strongly, has seen the first signs of dwindling 2018, which were very clear. And the nexus of currently now is shifting qualitatively away from the US, both in terms of political, rather, let's start with economic, political, military, and cultural hegemony. Let's enter it from a perspective of the economics. Today, comrades, as we speak, China has got a larger GDP than the US. 18% control of the world's GDP, and the US is trailing behind at about 15%. The US has got the most indebted economy in the world today. And most of its debt is owed both to China and Japan. There are more billionaires in China than they are in the US. So at an economic level, the US has dwindled in terms of economic hegemony. So anybody who wants to argue, as Sikoketo is trying to say that, is that the US is no longer hegemonic economically, comrades, because it has lost its economic power to China. China is a bigger power in terms of economics than the US. It has a bigger manufacturing industry, productive capacity. That's why they're responding better to COVID-19. The economic, rather the health infrastructure of the US is in tatters. They are unable to respond to COVID-19. China is able to respond, like we've all seen in the past few months, to a pandemic such as COVID-19 rather. Now, in terms of economic invincibility and hegemony, the US has collapsed. China has taken over as a new superpower. Let's take it further, comrades, to demonstrate the point that the nexus of power has shifted from the US. The Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and the World Bank, used to control development in the world and economies in the world because in terms of its conditionalities of funding, they would dictate how countries would be run. Today, we've got BRICS, which has created the new development bank. And that new development, Thato, the last time I checked, had funded about 37 infrastructure projects, hardly 3 years in existence. That tells you that the nexus of development funding is shifting away from structures controlled by the US, which are the Bretton Woods institutions. BRICS is another center of power in the world, which shifts the power away from the US. The G7 are no longer taking cue from the US. You had them now on the issues around the pandemic, where they are condemning the stance by Donald Trump for having suspended the funding to the World Health Organization. The UN is a power block, or rather a power pocket on its own today. Now I'm talking both state actors and non-state actors. On the state side, we've got China, which is emerging. Russia is rekindling itself to emerge again. But on the multilateral institutions and regional organizations, we've got both UN or BRICS, which are no longer taking cue from the US. We can go on and on, look at the G20 comrades, and say that the G20 is an alternative platform that does not feed direction from the US. To explain that the world we live in today, when read my paper that I've written on Mkhabul, page 28, is no longer unipolar, it is multipolar. This view that our strategy and tactics document has taken, that we are still living in a primarily unipolar and secondarily multipolar world, is schizophrenic and wrong to the core. The world currently as we live in is multipolar. And I want to implore you, particularly comrades from the ANC Youth League, that you must go and support us in passing a motion at the next conference of the ANC nationally. In fact, this should be a Youth League recommendation, that the ANC must characterize the balance of forces correctly and admit that the world is now multipolar and no longer unipolar. And, to build further on that, comrades, we must take cue from what is currently happening with COVID-19 and how the world is responding to it. I am arguing vehemently, comrades, that the spread of COVID-19 in the world today is actually a final nail on the coffin of US hegemony. We will see in the post-COVID-19 era that the US does no longer dictate terms of the world in very clear terms for all of us to see. Because the shelf life of hegemony, has an expiry date. And that's the essence of what I'm arguing this evening, to explain that the US has lost its power and that the expiry date of the hegemony is now in 2020, and we would see in the post-COVID-19 era that the US is no longer as powerful as it used to be. And it's beginning to show panic signs. Look at what they're doing when they engage on international matters. Trump goes on the open and said this is a Chinese disease. You can tell that this is a clear, it's not Trump going on with his verbal diarrhea as normal. It's a clear calculated strategy from a point of desperation to reverse the emerging hegemony of China, which finds concrete expression through brand bashing. That is an important point that we need to note, comrades, as a panic of sign from the US, which realizes that China is taking over. But we must be careful to celebrate, as Ho Chi Minh once said to his people, that the Americans are leaving, because we must be able to see that the Chinese are coming and that China might be the new oppressor. And we have seen over the past few months that China has been treating Africans in their own backyard. Xenophobic incidents galore in China that we need to interact with at this current conjuncture of the international balance of forces, where China is emerging as a superpower in the world. Because we must ask ourselves the fundamental question, on whose behalf are they arising? Because they're not arising on our behalf. We used to have China as an alliance with Africans, but it's very clear that some xenophobia, which is unprecedented, which goes against the grain of Maoist internationalism, is emerging in China. And we are worried that Commissar Xi Jinping is not grappling with this question, the way he should be handling it, that the Chinese are ill-treating people who in the past were in alliance with them in fighting revolutionary struggles in the world. Now, the point we need to note that China is not rising on our behalf, comrades. The question we must ask is, when is Africa rising? Because Africa has to rise on its own and occupy its own rightful place as a hegemon in the international balance of forces to join the others, so that it is able to contest views. It is able to contest the shaping of the world. It is able to contest the transformation of the UN Security Council and the veto powers that are still there, which comes from the situation of the Second World War. But perhaps as a penultimate point, Makaban, we must ask ourselves the question, why is it that Africa is struggling to rise? And what is it that it must do? Lenin talks about the importance of knowing where to begin once we've answered the question, what is to be done? I think Africa needs to deal with the problem of corruption as the first thing. We need to arrest all these thugs who are stealing from our people in government in African countries. We need to deal with the problem of war, comrades, and instability in the African continent, so that we talk as one voice to clean these wars, because we know that they're created from the West, fighting for our minerals in the continent. So we need to have a proper discussion around the wars in the continent as Africans. Thirdly, we need to, for Africa to rise, consider discussion, which is very important, on how to deal with issues of leadership in the continent, because I think Africa is suffering from a serious leadership crisis. People are elected on the basis of how much money they have, who they are connected with, and not in terms of the quality of leadership that they have. They're through the eye of the needle test that we need to talk about, Mataban, throughout the continent, not just in South Africa. So we need to correct the problem of leadership in the continent for Africa to rise, so that in the international balance of forces, which is multipolar, Africa is able to take its stake and rise, such as China is, because nobody will rise on our behalf. I thank you. Angola yo, Angola yo, Angola yo, mama, Angola yo. Kwito kwana vale, Angola yo. Bare Fidel Castro, Angola yo. Tumela machuni, Angola yo. Angola yo, mama, Angola yo. Kwito kwana vale, Angola yo. Amandla. Te. Shin.